Hello guys, you know that I like to make builds, but today I decided to look at other builds and I was going through some of the main websites where you can find builds, and some of these are MetaBattle. Also the other one is Maxroll, and obviously you have Questlog, which I'm primarily using. There is one major difference between these two websites, MetaBattle and Maxroll, compared to Questlog, and this is that Questlog is mostly for community, so everybody can make a build there and can share it. However, MetaBattle and Maxroll are not really like that, and you can just make a builds and post it over there. So that would kind of imply that the people that are making these builds are probably very knowledgeable, very experienced in the game, and they have tested out a lot of things before others, which would require you to spend a lot of money so you can actually test out different builds. But nonetheless, I saw a couple of things that are a little bit weird, and I just wanted to point out if you're checking these websites. So let's just go through Crusader. There's just the 3 builds for different situations and that's it. And you would think these are made by very experienced people that know what they're doing, and most likely that is the case. Just click on this one, small scale PvP. And then you can look at the large scale PvP, but that's a different topic. Let's just go for the first one and then we're going to check the other one as well. So one thing you see here, if you have to choose between the different websites, I choose Questlog because it has the most amount of information you can get there, and also there's a lot more freedom, and it's community based, so people are sharing between. On this website, first of all, you don't see any stats. It's some brief explanation of what you should be doing, and you have primary and secondary stats, but generally we're not looking at anything here. You have the first couple of things, pretty basic stuff that most websites have, just kind of brief explanation about the class. Fair enough. Then look at the skills and the passives, which is also fine. There is also explanation down here. Then we're going to go all the way to tier 2 end game, right? This is pretty good. That's end game, which also suggests that you'll be running maxed out weapon masteries, which is 200. And based on what I've experienced so far, for me, where I'm level 120, 130 on my weapons, that means I need another 150 levels in total to get both my weapons to 200. This would probably take about 2.5, 3 months or something like that. It really depends how it scales up. Another thing that's even scarier when I look at the build, I know it says end game, but realistically, be aware this is gonna take ages. Just briefly going through them. First of all, Auric Vanguard, all this set, they're using 4 pieces. Some of these are cheap, but others are very expensive. Unless they actually change something about how you obtain those items, it's gonna take ages before you can actually get them. It's going to be a lot of Lucent, but that's not that important anyway. First of all, you look at this one for a very long time because I didn't have information, but up until recently I realized this is actually dropping from an Archboss. So this is almost like putting on Archboss weapons as well. You see here, that's a bit weird to me. Later we're going to check it out. They drop in weaken resistance on this cloak, and I wouldn't really want to do that. Later I'll explain you why. But most of the other things look pretty standard and normal in my opinion, so everything looks fine. So the biggest problem for me, this section here with the skills, Blade Momentum. This is an epic passive skill, which is pretty powerful, at least that's how it looks like. Activate on Shoot, Throw, or Annihilating Slash. It's giving you extra damage while decreasing your defense. Fine, it's good for DPS. Now, the problem is, going all the way up, you don't see any of these skills on the setup. Realistically, this is useless, because it's really not going to proc anything here. They're just not using those skills, and you need very specific setup to actually use those skills. That's one thing. They're going to Greatsword. You see there's this passive right here, Fortified Unity. It gives additional defense whenever you use Da Vinci's Courage, Da Vinci's Shield, which is the spec of Da Vinci's Courage, Blood Devotion, and Devoted Sanctuary. That's pretty good. It's very powerful. However, once again, same issue. This build doesn't use any of these skills. That's pretty not activate anything. You do have this one to proc. On the build itself, they didn't really activate Blade Harvest, which is pretty good passive as well. Yet this is probably no-brainer. You should always use Perception Balance. You can also see another issue right here. It's happening because by default, you're going to have activated Roar Amplifier. They could have actually activated these two or any of these two, which upgrades Garrett's Patience, which they do use on this build. However, the Roar Amplifier will only work if you have Spectrum of Agony, which they didn't equip right here. So there's like a couple of inconsistencies with the build. And the major problem is, if you're a new player and you haven't really experienced the game that much, so you don't have that much knowledge, you might make this build. Just a lot of people, I'm assuming, are just copy pasting the builds, at least new players that don't know much. they have to do something, right? And they level up, they follow a guide, just pretty much copy paste the whole thing. And then they're going to be thinking, why is this not really working? Like, it's not optimal. It's going to do something, but it's not going to be the best. And they may experience some difficulties when not realizing that some of those things just don't work all that much. Then going down here, I would say artifacts, that's probably the one thing that I like the most about this build. They're still very versatile, and what I see here is actually not bad. I like this. So this setup will give you 100 endurance. I think it was about 100 hit chance as well, plus 1500 HP altogether. So you're not going to get any of the second or third effects, but you're going to get all these. And also they specifically put these as actives and passives. This one will give you temporarily 5000 HP, maximum and current HP. And this will passively, whenever you get some sort of crowd control on you, it will ramp up skill damage resistance. So, but like generally speaking, this is the one thing that I like the most about this build is the artifacts. Another thing that to me it's a little bit weird, you know that we clicked the first one here for small scale, and the second build is large scale. Click on the second build, and just looking at all that, there's basically no difference. You see? Pretty much the same. Then we look at the masteries as well, identical as well. What does that all mean? Generally speaking, you're gonna have slightly different setup for large scale compared to small scale. I would say small scale might be PvP arena, and large scale could be anything with 5+ or like full parties, even going all the way to like vanguards these days. You would be using very different things in large scale that we just don't see that here. So this is also misleading to my understanding. However, if you look at the description right here, it's also identical. It says PvP large scale and PvP small scale. So why do they even have two builds here when they're absolutely identical? Look at just the preview of the skills. Absolutely the same stuff. Of course, the PvE build is different, but even though that's a whole different topic, for PvE, the gear is absolutely identical. Understand that the game is really grindy, and you know you're not expected to just get 2 sets, but realistically, if you're a full PvE player and follow this guide, you're not going to have optimal build for PvE because a lot of those things are PvP oriented. So you're not going to get the most of your PvE build this way. This is absolutely identical to the PvP build gear-wise. And this is just not the most optimal thing. Even when you look at the runes, melee hit chance. So you don't need that in PvE. One thing they did change is the masteries, of course, on both of the setups. However, it seems that the artifacts are also identical, and you probably don't need those things in PvE as well. So yeah, that's just to be aware. If you're a new player and you're following MetaBattle guides, just be aware of those things. This is not ideal to me. This is not really the most optimal setup. If we check the other website, Maxroll, I will look for the same build. So that's gonna be SNS, PvP, tank, that's it. That's the build we're looking for. So they give you a bit more information on Maxroll that I give them that. It's pretty decent. And you can learn a bit more about the build that you're about to play. Once again, you have the end game, which just to be aware, this is going to take you a lot of time or it's going to be really expensive to actually make. Just so you know that. At least now we have, on Maxroll, we have stats, so we do know what to expect from the build. Additional information here. Also looking at artifacts as well, which, you know, this is completely different setup, of course. That's their idea, their version of it. Damage reduction, shield block chance, and then they have these two different things when it comes to the passive and the actives are the Greed Seeker. So that's just going to give you extra endurance. So going all the way down to skills. Now for the biggest part, if I just look at these and compare them to like a couple of months ago when we had tier 1, not much have really changed. So I don't know if they just don't want to experiment or anything, but it's almost identical skills to tier 1, if not pretty much the same. This time on this build, they actually use Spectrum of Agony. So overall, this looks much better now. Again, they use resistance scale. I mean, I use it as well. You don't have that many good stuff in here, to be honest, that many good things that you can put on, but they're just running 1 epic. You see, that's a choice, right? You don't have to actually run 2 epic passives as well, but of course you can just ramp up your endurance anyway. That's really up to your preference. Once again, very end game stuff. You got time bomb. And then looking at the greatsword, now this is much better made guide in my opinion. You have a lot of things that are actually working together and they proc together anyway. So it's not misleading compared to MetaBattle in this case. So now looking at the 2 builds, this is my version of the build. On the left side, that's Crusader PvP, that's my version. And on the right side, you have the MetaBattle build. And we're just going to compare the stats. Yes, I did sacrifice a little bit extra points here just to get the 60 threshold, but I think it was worth it anyway. And this side, the attribute points on their build, because we don't actually know the exact amount of stats they have. I decided to put the points this way because it would make sense to get the thresholds or hit the max stat points anyway. I might be a little bit wrong here, but generally speaking, I think this is going to be as close as possible. And then we're looking at the base result in the end. Damage is almost the same. These stats are not super important when it comes to tanking, and the difference is minor. Shoot lock chance and penetration chance are very similar, not a huge difference here. Then we look at critical hit chance and heavy attack chance. So obviously both of the builds are not leaning towards DPS anyway. However, my build managed to get slightly higher numbers. I would say actually more than double when we do heavy attacks, and we do synergize a lot with heavy attacks, keep that in mind, and also a bit more critical hit chance as well. Now, of course, you're not going to be critting versus anybody that has endurance, even not much endurance, but versus anybody that's running evasion build, since they're not going to have endurance, if any at all, you'll be able to crit a bit more often than with their build. Then looking at the hit chance, now their build has slightly higher hit chance versus my build, but I think it's also in a very good spot with 2400. MetaBattle build has above 2500, so it's like 140 points more. Then we're going all the way down here. The defenses, we have significantly higher defense. This is primarily coming from a full set of Forsaken Zealot, keep that in mind. So much higher melee defense. Also, they have negative impact from some masteries. We have also higher range defense and magic as well. So all the defense are much higher, especially melee defense. Then endurance wise, with their build, they managed to push slightly higher endurance on melee and range. And on our build, we have just a little bit higher magic endurance, almost the same. But personally, I would say both of the builds have a decent amount of endurance. Heavy attack evasion, now they have some magic heavy attack evasion. Our heavy attack evasion is slightly higher when it comes to melee and range. Magic is almost the same. Critical damage resistance, yes, like we said, they have even more than us. Then when it comes to HP, they do have slightly higher amount of HP, so that is a good thing. Keep that in mind. 4500 HP more. And the other stats are not super important. Hit damage boost, small difference. Their build is slightly higher here. Buff duration, they have considerably higher buff duration, but you'll see why later. Debuff duration is almost the same. Cooldown speed, both of the builds don't have high cooldown speed, keep that in mind. Then we're looking at the resistance. You know, earlier, like I said, that I don't really understand why they put weakened resistance when they could have just straight up get a debuff duration. For me personally, that's kind of useless, because anybody that's applying weaknesses like mages and stuff like that, they're naturally going to have a very high weaken chance anyway. So that's not going to help them that much. So I just have a lower stat here because that's not really a priority for me. Then we look at stun and collision resistance. This is a huge difference versus the two builds. You see that stun resistance is almost double. It's like 400 points more. Their build has like 600. My build has over 1000. So in order to get stunned on this particular build that I'm making, you have to specifically focus on building stun chance to actually get through this resistance over 1000. Same thing goes for collision resistance. And you can also play around with these to get even higher, but I think this is a very decent spot, and higher than that would be overkill. Only specifically designed anti-collision builds will probably get through that, which is more than 1100, and their build gets below 900. So it's not going to be that crazy difficult to get through that realistically. So their build is just below 900, which is also not a small difference. It's still going to resist a lot of collisions, but of course it's not that much anyway. Then crowd control chances, pretty much everything else is higher, but it's not really that important because mostly you'll be applying stuns and collisions. We're not focusing on weaken. We don't have that many curses that we apply to opponent. And as you can see, collision chance here is much higher. It actually kind of answers to the build itself to be able to apply collisions more players than you'd run with their build, which is around 750. My build is almost 1100 as well. And this is super important for any crusader, in my opinion, for any tank generally speaking, because you want to control the field. This is the purpose of the build. You want to be pushing and putting people around, and if your collision chance is lower, it's going to make it more difficult. Realistically, anybody that has this collision resistance, and that's not really that difficult to get to this amount, with this collision chance, it's going to be possible to apply collision, and you do want to apply collision as much as possible. Of course, my collision chance is also lower than my resistance, but again, to get that resistance, you got to build specifically around that. So this is the major difference in the two builds. Just to summarize, the most important factor right here is be aware when you look at these guides online. Personally, I would only look at them as reference just to get some initial information, but I feel like the best possible builds would be to either go on Questlog and just look at different builds that people are making, and also other people just like me are making videos about those builds, explaining a lot of things in detail so you actually know what those builds are all about, compared to these other websites where you don't really have that much information. It's just on paper and that's it. You don't even have any video or anything about that. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe, and see you next time.